In this video, we're going to be taking a look at object-oriented programming. This is going to be a mini-series. There's too much to do to capture it all in one video, so we've broken it up into a series for you. If you're getting serious about programming, object-oriented programming is something that is imperative to learn. So let's go ahead and let's jump right in. So OOP stands for object-oriented programming. So anytime you see a post or any text referring to OOP, they're referring to object-oriented programming. It consists of many things, and there are three that you must be familiar with when you're starting off, and that is a class, the methods, and the attributes. Now, there are many things besides these, but when you're getting started with object-oriented programming, these are the three you need to focus on because you can't do the rest until you understand these. Now, a class is a blueprint or template for an object that you create. Now, objects represent real-world objects that can have many different attributes or properties. A class contains the methods and the attributes, and we're going to be programming as well. So we're just going to talk about some terms. We'll be going back and forth to really understand object-oriented programming rather than aimlessly or unnecessarily typing in random lines of code where you're left to figure out the rest for yourself. We don't do that here. Inside your class, you have methods, and it's a procedure that is part of the class or the blueprint. Now, these are written like subs, but we call them methods, and we're using VB.NET, so that's why we say they're written like subs, but we don't call them subs, we call them methods. And then we have attributes. So inside the class are the data items, and we call these attributes. Now, these are like variables, but we don't call them variables, we call them attributes, and all of them need to be declared not using DIM, but we want to use the words private or protected. It all depends upon inheritance, whether that's being used or not. If you don't know what inheritance is, that is fine because we'll be covering that in the next one or two videos. So when we talk about attributes, there's a couple things that you need to know. Private. We said they need to be private or protected. Well, private is an option, and these attributes can only be used in this single class and no other classes. It can only be used in that one class. This includes not being able to use them in inherited classes. So if you're using private, you can't even use them in inherited classes. That's where protected comes in. It can be used in excess in multiple classes if they are a derived class, and like we said, we'll be doing more on that later. The last option that's not really used a whole lot is public, and that can be accessed from any class at all. And then you're kind of moving away from encapsulation, which we'll talk about a little later. So let's go ahead and actually create a class. So we're going to create a class for students, and one thing we might want to ask ourselves is, what are some simple things that all students have in common? Well, they have a name, they have a grade, and they have some type of ID number. So we're going to use student name to hold the student name. We're going to use the variable grade to hold the grade that they are in, and we're going to use ID to hold their ID or identification number. So we're going to create a new project. We're going to call it creating a class, and we're going to do it in console. So we're going to flip over to VB.NET and get started programming. Okay, so we're at our coding screen. We are in console. You can do this in Windows Form application if you want. It's all about the coding of object-oriented programming. So let's go ahead and let's create our class. Start with something very simple. So we're going to be inside the module, but we're going to be outside sub-main. And we're going to create a custom class. And all we're going to do is we're going to type in class student. So we are telling the computer, okay, we're creating a new class, a new template. We're calling it student. That is how you create a class. It is that simple. Let's flip back over and see what we can put inside of our class. So we said we're going to do student name, grade, and ID. So we're going to create the attributes inside. So we're going to call it sname, just a shortened student name. If you want to do student name, you can. We're going to do sname, grade, and ID. And we're going to create them together, which is what we're about to do, flipping back over. Now, they are going to be private because there's not going to be any inheritance here. So we're going to dimensionalize them using private. Let's flip back over and do that now. So right here at the very top where we left off with class student, We're not going to use dim. We're not going to do that. We want this to be private, only accessible from this class because there's no inheritance going here. So we're going to use sname. That's going to be a string because that is a student name. We're going to do the grade level that they're in. We're going to do that as an integer, grade 9, 10, 11, 12, or whatever grade they may be in. And then we're going to do ID, and we're going to do that as a string. Depending on where you go to school, there may be a combination of alphanumeric characters, letters, and numbers, so we're going to leave that as a string. So what we're going to do now is we can start talking about the next part, the constructor. So let's flip back over to our notes before we move on so we can understand the next set of code that we're about to do. Okay, so our constructor. So we have a blueprint for a student. We can create the object. We have our class, which is the blueprint, and it has attributes, the student name, the grade, and ID. So we have the blueprint, but we need a constructor to actually construct the object. Now, to build the object, we need the constructor, and constructors can be used multiple ways, and you must become familiar with how they can be used. Now, a constructor, what it does is it initializes the object and assigns values to the attributes. Now, the constructor will allow us to actually create an object with the values. We're still going to be in our class student, but let's go ahead and let's create the constructor with the prompts. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do public sub. Now, this is a method, or this is actually a constructor. Public sub new is our constructor. Now, in Visual Basic and many other programming languages, you don't have to put the constructor in. If you don't have public sub new, or if you're using another language, a constructor, most of the time the language will put one in the background for you, even though you do not see it. So let's go ahead and let's start adding stuff to our constructor. So we're just going to put this is our constructor. And this is great to look back at if we need to, if we need some notes or something. And we're going to ask them, what is the student's name? And there's lots of ways to do this. You don't have to do it inside the constructor. There's lots of ways to do this. The reason we are doing it inside the constructor is to show you something. Then we're going to do console.writeLine, and we're going to ask them what is the grade, or what grade is the student in. Then we're going to do grade. So basic stuff here, just getting some user input and storing it in variables. And then we want to tell them, please enter the ID number. Or we could just say ID. Okay. So once we have that, we can do, we have our constructor, which will actually construct the objects. So if we run our program, nothing is going to happen just yet. But let's go ahead and save, and let's talk about the next thing that we need to do. Okay, so we've asked some prompts to the user, which hasn't been accessed by the code yet. But let's talk about the methods. Now, because our attributes are private, we cannot directly access them. Well, if I go to submain, which is outside my class, why do we even have them if we cannot directly access them? Well, we cannot directly access them, but we can access them. And what we need is what is known as a get method. So there are get methods and set methods. We are not using a set method just yet, but we could, and we will. So we have 3 attributes, which means we need 3 get methods, and they must be public. So what we are going to do is we are going to write a get method for sname, which is a student name, grade, and ID. We're going to go ahead and code this now, because remember, it's not just coding, it's understanding the code. Let's flip back over to VB.net. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're still going to be inside of our class. Make sure you're not outside the in class. So we have our attributes. We have our constructor, public sub new, with some prompts inside there, but we're still inside of our class. And what we are creating is what is known as get methods. Now, if you're familiar with programming, and hopefully you are, this is a little advanced, you should know the difference between procedures and functions. And you should know that functions return a value. If you don't, well, you do now. Functions return a value. So we're not going to use public sub. We're going to use public function, and they must be public. And our first one is going to be to get the name. We're not going to pass any parameters here. We're going to return it as a string. And all we simply do is we do return s name. Now, we're going to be able to use that get function a little later, because if we set the values like we did right up here, we need to be able to get them. We also need get the grade, and that's going to return as a string. And you'll notice all we're doing is returning the attributes here. And then we're going to need a third one, get ID, and that is going to be returned as a string. The grade is actually an integer. We want to keep those data types straight there, and return ID. Okay, so with these get methods, the first word is always get. It's always get. The second one is what you are getting. So we are getting the name, we are getting the grade, we are getting the ID. So now that we've done that, we can talk about our class being complete and a term that goes along with that you'll definitely hear in object-oriented programming. Let's flip back over so we can understand just a little bit more. Okay, so we've written our get method. So now let's talk about the term. Now that our class is complete, we call that encapsulation. So our class student is complete. The blueprint has been written. And because our class contains everything inside the class that will be used with our object, we say that it is encapsulated. Encapsulation is putting the data or the attributes in a single unit. What is that single unit? That single unit is a class. So when you have your attributes and your methods inside of a single class, we say it's encapsulated. And that's what encapsulation is, putting everything together in a single class. Now that we've done that, we can actually create our first object. So you should know the drill by now. We're going to flip over back to VB.net, and we're going to create our first object. All right, let's scroll down to our submain, and which is going to be the first procedure that runs when we start our program. And this is where we are going to construct our object. So what we're going to do is we're going to use dim, and we're going to do this student. And we're going to do it as new student. Okay, so let's talk about what this is doing. This right here is our object. It's called this student. We're dimensionalizing it as a new student. Where did that name come from? That comes all the way back up here from our class students. So when we're dimensionalizing or creating an object, we got to give it a name, which we'll call this student. And we need to say, okay, what blueprint or what class are we using? And we're using student. And you'll see here substudent.new is our constructor. So let's go ahead, let's save it, let's run it, and let's see what happens. What is the student's name? So we could type in the student's name. Let's say his name is Jack. Let's say he's in 12th grade, and his ID number we'll say is 34815. And great, we stored them, but we didn't output them. But let's talk about why these prompts are running. When you use dim this student as new student, something is happening. Let's flip back to our notes and take a look at that. The reason our prompts are running is because we have created an object. The public sub new, the constructor, is running when we do this. When we type in dim this student as new student, the constructor creates or constructs that object. Any code inside public sub new inside the constructor is going to run. And we can now get our attributes and display them because we've given them values. Now we can display them. Let's go ahead and code that together. Okay, so we created those get methods earlier. Now we can use them. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do console.writeLine, and all we're going to do is the student's name is, and if I type in sname, you'll see that's not an option. I'm getting an error. We cannot directly access them. So what we need to do is we need to say this student, which is our object here. And now it says, okay, what method do you want to access from this student? And I want this one right here, get name. Notice you do not see sname, you do not see grade, you do not see ID. Because we can access the methods though, we can actually get the name and ID. So we're going to do get name. Then we're going to do console.WriteLine. Let's say the student's grade level is, and we'll do this student, and we want to get the grade. And this is why you want to name your methods something like get or set, so you know exactly what you're looking for. It makes the end programming much easier. The student's ID is, and then we'll output their ID number, and we're going to use this student. What method do we want to use? Get ID. So let's go ahead, let's run our program, let's type those values in, and let's see those get methods in action. So what is the student's name? We'll say his name is Jack. Let's say he's in 12th grade. His ID number is 34815. These are numbers I'm just making up off the top of my head. And now we should see it output. The student's name is Jack. The student's grade level is 12. His ID is 34815. Now that I've created a student, I have a blueprint for each student I create, and that blueprint is a name, a grade, an ID, the attributes. I have my constructor, which I know is running because I can see these prompts show up. And the reason we put it in the constructor was just so you can see when the constructor actually runs. You really don't want to put prompts in the constructor. This is just to show you that the constructor will run. Then we have some get methods here, which return our attributes so we can indirectly access them. So that's what we're going to do. Now, we said there are many ways to use a constructor. Let's flip back over to our notes and take a look at the next way on how to use a constructor. Now, we're going to be changing our constructor because we said there are many ways to use a constructor. We're going to update our constructor that we constructed. So what I need you to do is go ahead and pause the video, comment out your code in your submain, everything except for the creation of the object. Leave those get methods in there. Don't delete your code. The whole reason for doing this is so you can look back at your code and see all the different things we did and the different ways to do it. So let's update our constructor together and see a different way of using it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to update just a little bit. We're going to go ahead and comment this out as well. And the reason for that is if we're going to change our constructor, we need to see the different ways it can be used. If we just delete this, we're not really going to be able to see one way that it's being used. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a new constructor, and that works a little differently. So we're going to do public sub new. That part doesn't change, but here's what we're going to do now. We're going to do by val, and we're going to do in as string, by val g as integer, and then one more by val I as string, and then we're going to do in sub. Now, you may say in g I. Those are terrible parameter names. It is common practice in object-oriented programming to use the first letter of the ID or of the attribute you're working with. Lowercase n for name, lowercase g for grade, lowercase I for ID. Now, if you're running a for loop in the constructor, I don't know why you would, but if you were, you would not be able to use I. You would have to do like for j equals or for x equals any letter except for I, or you could change this. So that's what we're going to be doing. Now, what we need to do is we need to go down to our object, and we should see an error. So let's scroll down to our object, and boom, we see an error. Let's go ahead and comment this whole thing out. Let's go ahead and do that. So we can see different ways that we can create an object. Let's go ahead and do this again. This student as new student. I want that capital T there. And we're going to see a red line. Don't worry about that red line. It'll go away in a moment. We'll talk about why we have the red line. Let's go back up to our constructor. We need to actually assign the values. So what we're going to do is we're going to do sname equals in. We're going to do grade equals G. And then what we're going to do is ID equals I. Now, just a recap, in case you're new to programming and you wanted to jump in with object-oriented programming, we're passing the arguments to be accepted as parameters. In is going to be assigned into sname. Whatever G equals will be assigned into grade. Whatever I equals will be assigned into ID. So let's scroll back down. Let's talk about why we're getting this error. That's a problem here. Let's switch to our notes and talk about why we're getting that error so we can fix it. So we now have a red line for our creation of an object, and that's a problem, but it's only a temporary problem, but we need to understand why that is there. If we just fix it, and we don't talk about why it's there, we're missing the whole point of coding, which is not just the code, but understand your code, to problem solve, to be able to fix your code when you run into a problem. Now, let's talk about why we had that red line, and we'll fix it. Now, this is because when we create the object using that public sub new, we must identify what is inside the parentheses of our public sub new. So we're going to fix that right now. Now, you can use your name and your ID number, but we're going to switch back and we're going to talk about what we need to do to fix it. And it's a very easy fix. Now, remember we said the constructor runs when it's constructing or creating an object. Because there are 3 parameters, we must pass 3 arguments. Now, it needs to be in order. If I look at my constructor, I can see it is name, grade, and then ID number. So I'll use a made-up name, Jack. Then I'm going to put a comma. Then I'm going to put the grade. Now, because it's an integer, I don't need to put it in quotes. I'm going to put a comma, and then we need the third item, which is the ID number. And because that is a string, I do need to put that in quotes. And now my red line is gone. If I only pass one object, or 2 objects, you can see there's a red line. And that's because I have in, I have G, but I need the ID. And it says right here, argument not specified for the parameter I. And there we go. And that gets rid of the red line. When we're talking about coding, it's important to understand the code, not just type what somebody else has. And that's what we try to do in all of our videos. But you don't care about that. You're here to learn. So let's keep learning. Let's switch back to our notes and look at another way that we can use the constructor. So we're going to update our constructor again. Now, using prompts outside our constructor, that's a possibility that you can do as well. When we are doing the prompts outside the constructor, which is pretty common, you need methods known as set methods. So we're going to ask them for the student name, the grade level, and ID, but we're going to use set methods. Go ahead and comment out your constructor code, your public sub new, as well as your creation of an object, so we can see another way to use the constructor. You know, what we did not do was we did not show our code. So what we need to do is uncomment these get methods out, because we're going to need them again. And what we're going to do is we're going to run our code, and it should say the student's name is Jack. He's in 12th grade, and his ID number. And there it is. Student's name is Jack. Student's grade level is 12. Student's ID is 34815. When you're using a constructor or the constructor like this, and you have your public sub new, this is usually going to be the way when you know the values that are going to be assigned, because you're going to have to put them in here. You're going to have to know what that data already is. You could ask for it and assign the variables that way, but that kind of defeats the purpose, because you can just use public sub new. But let's get back to our code. So what we're going to do is we're going to comment this out. We're going to comment out our constructor, and we're going to create a new constructor, this time one without any parameters. So what we're going to do is we're going to do public sub new, and we're done. Now, depending on what class, computer science class you are taking, if you're at a university, your professor may want to see you use the constructor. If you're in Cambridge, they definitely want to see you use the constructor. So really find out before you're assessed if you need to do that or not. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get coding. So we need some set methods. And the reason we need some set methods is we're going to ask them, okay, what is their name? What is their grade level? What is their ID number? When you do it this way, you definitely don't want to fall back into procedural programming. You want to stay object-oriented. So let's go ahead and create some variables first. We're going to do this student as new student, creating a new object. What template or blueprint are we using? We're using the student class. Now, we're going to do name as string, and you want to spell string correctly. We're going to do grade level, do that as an integer, and we're going to do ID num as a string, and we're simply going to go ahead and ask them to enter the name, the grade level, and ID number. Let's go ahead and fast forward so that is done. Okay, so we have some prompts here and we're assigning them to variables, and you may be saying, well, those are not our attributes at all. This is not object-oriented programming, and you would be correct. So let's make it object-oriented programming. The whole reason we need to get their name, and we could do this in our class, but we could also do it here, and this is where set methods come in. We need to set the value of name to the attribute sname. For that, we need set methods. Earlier we said there were set methods and get methods. So let's go up here. It really doesn't matter where they go. I try to put my set methods before my get methods. There is no right or wrong way to put it. Just make sure you're inside your class student. And here is what we are going to do. There are, this works almost like the constructor. So we're going to do public sub, and you want to do that on a new line. Public sub, and what we want to do is we want to set the name. Now, in here, we're going to do the same thing that we did in our constructor. We're going to set the name, and we're going to use m, and we're going to say sname equals n. That is to set the name. Then I need another method. And what do I want to set? I want to set the grade level, and I'm going to do g, and that was an integer. And I'm going to do grade equals g, and then I need my last set method, which is to set the ID. And we're going to do I as string. That is the parameter. And we're going to do ID equals I. It is that simple. Now that we have our set methods inside our class, we can actually use our set methods and get back into using object-oriented programming. So I don't know what the student's name is. I need the user to enter the name. Well, if I just stick with this variable and do console.writeLine name, I've gotten away from object-oriented programming. I'm back into procedural. So here is what we need to do. We need to use our set method. We used our get method earlier. This time, we're going to use our set method. So this student, because that is the name of my object, what method do I want to use? I want to set the name. Now, when I set the name, what argument am I passing? I'm passing name. And now my red line is gone. I'm going to do the same thing down here with grade level. This student dot get, or not get, set. And this is why you want to name your methods this way. It's very easy to mix them up. I'm going to pass grade level. And then for the last one, this student dot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the ID, and I'm going to pass ID num. And now I've used my set methods. But what I need to do after I set it is get it. So I have my get methods right here, and I need to put these in the right spot. There's no point in outputting it before I set them. If I output it, nothing is going to happen. So I want to put them in the right spot. Here we go. We're going to uncomment these out. And we want to uncomment them, not comment them twice. So let's go ahead and let's run our code and see what happens. So enter the student's name. We're going to use Jack. We're going to say he's in 12th grade. We're going to use the same ID numbers I made up off the top of my head. If everything goes according to plan, and it will, we'll see his name, his grade level, and his ID. Here it is, using object-oriented programming. We output his name. His name is Jack. He's in 12th grade. His ID number is 34815. Let's talk about the code real quick. One more time. This right here allows us to use our set methods to assign values to the attributes. And our attributes were sname, grade, and ID. And because they're in a class and they're declared as dimensionalized using private, they can only be used in that class, nowhere else. My in class is right here, which means my submain is not part of that class. So I create some variables that will hold temporary data, and then using my set methods, I will assign the values of these temporary data to my attributes. Once I set everything, I can then make sure it works by using my get methods. Let's flip back over to our notes to give you a chance to work on something, and then we'll go over the solution. Okay, so we've coded our set methods. So now let's take a look at using selection statements in our methods. Selection statements are your if statements or case statements. So what I've done here is I've written an exercise to give you an opportunity to update your public class student that uses selection statements, if or case, and then we'll go over the solution, a chance for you to try object-oriented programming out. So imagine that for each grade level, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, there's an introductory movie. A lot of times at orientation, there are some movies, some introductory movies about classes that certain grade levels can take. We'll say 9th graders watch a orientation movie that's simply called Freshman. We have 10th graders. Their movie is called Sophomore, 11th grade juniors, 12th grade seniors. So we need to create a set movie method and a get movie method with an if statement. What I need you to do is I need you to pause the video and give it a try, and then we'll go over the solution. So we need a set movie method, we need a get movie method, we need an if statement. Now, that if statement either needs to go in set movie method or get movie method. You're also going to need another attribute such as movie, and make sure you stick with object-oriented programming. We're going to go over the solution. So you're going to need to, there's going to be an if statement involved with what grade level they are in. So let's pause the video and give you a chance before we go over the solution. All right, let's go over the solution. Let's see how you did. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to leave all my set methods and get methods, but the first thing I need to do is I need to create one called movie. And that's simply going to be a string because it's entitled freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. So I'm going to leave my constructor there. We have them enter the student's name, this grade level. Now, let's talk about set grade level. That is where I'm going to set the movie. So using the grade level. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a set method. So we're going to do public sub set movie. Now, when we're setting the movie, we're not asking them what movie they want to see. What do I need to accept? I need to accept the grade level. So I do by val g as string, and this is where I will set the movie. And I'm just simply going to do some if statements here. If, and I say g equals freshman, then movie, or it's not going to equal freshman, it's going to equal 9 because grade level is an integer. Whoop. So here we go. And that needs to be an integer, not a string. You want to make sure you're using the same data type. It's very easy to make a mistake. The movie equals, and then I'm going to say equals freshman. And then I can do else if, and then else if g, make sure we're on the right line here. If g equals 10, then movie equals sophomore. Else if g equals 11, then movie equals junior. Else if g equals 12, then movie equals senior. And then make sure I have my end if. I do. So that is to set the movie. Now, I need to call that set movie method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that right after we get the grade level. So right after we do the grade level, we're going to do this student dot set movie, and I'm passing grade level because it's based on their grade. I don't need to create a new variable asking them what movie they want to watch. They don't get to decide what movie they watch. Based on their grade, they'll get to see a specific movie. But now that we set it, we need to get it because we need to output it. So let's go ahead and let's create our set method or our get method. So what we're going to do is we're going to do public function. And what we're going to do is we're going to say get movie, and that's going to be a string. We are going to return movie. That's all we're going to do. And then we're going to test our code and make sure it works. So what we're going to do here, we're just simply going to copy and paste this line. We'll get rid of this student.getID. And we'll say the student's orientation movie. I spelled orientation wrong. Let's see here. There we go. That looks better. And then this student dot, and we want to get the movie. So because Jack is a senior, it should say, hopefully, that he'll be watching the senior movie. So Jack, grade 12, and his ID number, the student's name is Jack, grade level is 12, his ID is 34815. The student's orientation movie is senior. So that is the solution. We create a get method to get the movie based on the grade level. I'm sorry, the set method based on the grade level. Once we assign that value, then we can get the movie they will be watching. It's very important here. You do not have a local variable called movie where you're outputting the movie. Make sure you're outputting the attribute that is used in our class. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below, and we'll see you guys in part 2 of our mini series on object-oriented programming.